decided that I would do a whisper walk in the woods. It's a beautiful day out, and for this one, I decided to wear my headset microphone, which is different. So now you might pick up some sounds that are around me right now, like airplanes, helicopters, or maybe not. You might just pick up the wind, the sound of the leaves. I've done a bunch of these walks in the Maryland woods, and my time in Maryland is coming to a close soon, as soon as I finish my thesis, and I'll be heading back to California. But it's such a beautiful, perfect day today that I'm taking a break, and I thought I would get out and get outside. So we'll just walk and see how this goes today. I don't really have anything particular I want to talk about. Just beautiful woods right now. You can see all the colors and the shadows shifting as the light comes through the trees. And then I see birds. I've seen a squirrel. They have a particular species of squirrel here in these woods that I don't remember seeing in other parts of the United States. The squirrels are black. So they have the regular gray squirrels that you see everywhere. But they also, for some reason, have a variety here in these woods. Although they do seem more rare, that are black in color. Otherwise, they look just like the other squirrels. I don't know if that's a particular Northern Virginia, Maryland thing or what. I'm not a squirrelologist, if that's a thing. I'm sure there's actually a name for it. A specialist in the science of squirrels. But whatever it is, I'm not that. I'd say if there's anything that I'm more of a specialist in, it's in psychology and counseling. I've done that for most of my adult life. And an interesting thing is I've always been fascinated by Freud and by his life and how he developed his theories of the mind. And something that a lot of people don't know is that even though many of Freud's theories have been proven to be probably incorrect or based on what some people call pseudoscience. In other words, it pretended to be science, but it really wasn't, because it wasn't provable or testable. That a lot of the terminology and the ideas that he had have become ubiquitous. In other words, they're all throughout modern society and modern counseling in psychological theory. So just the idea of the subconscious and the unconscious, or the preconscious, all those things go back to Freud. The idea of repression, of transference, of different kinds of complexes, all are Freudian. So the language of Freud definitely has become part of the lexicon of psychotherapy and of psychology. And there's a group of therapists called Neo-Freudians who took what Freud had begun and altered it a little bit to try and make it maybe more accurate. And the other thing that Freud can be credited with is trying to develop a treatment for psychological diseases or psychological problems. So up until he started seeing patients and doing what he called the talking cure, many problems and disorders had no actual treatment. So he studied for a while in Paris under Jean-Claude Charcot at the Salpêtrière, and Charcot was working with hysterics, which we don't even use that term anymore, but hysterical disorders, primarily in women, but Charcot pointed out that they were also in men. And the etiology or the beginning of these disorders was often sexual, so of course Freud was fascinated by this. In fact, he watched some of Charcot's demonstrations. So what Charcot would do is he would admit these hysterics or people that were having physical type symptoms, but no neurological or physical reason for the symptoms. Paralysis and I guess you would call dissociation type disorders. He would admit them to his clinic, and then he would study them and try and find a physical reason for the symptoms they had. Sometimes it was seizures, sometimes it was paralysis or numbness. And when he couldn't find one, he would classify it as hysterical. And hystia is a Greek word, which I believe is the same one that is the root of hysterectomy. And in other words, it was a disorder of women's reproductive systems, of their ovaries. That was the prevailing thought at the time, that these women, because they were women, had these type of disorders. And there was actually a belief that they were physical in nature. But you couldn't really find a cause for some of the things that people were seeing. So, Charcot would use hypnosis on the women too, and they were primarily women in his clinic. He would use hypnosis to induce the symptoms. And he would do these exhibitions where he would induce the symptoms. Now, even at the time, there were some physicians and philosophers, actually, in France who believed that Charcot was a charlatan and that he was using hypnosis and suggestion And these susceptible women were just acting out the symptoms. Where Charcot's stance was that he was using the hypnosis to trigger the symptoms. So some of these symptoms were very graphic and sexualized in nature. So Freud, who was a neurologist like Charcot, after he graduated from medical school in Vienna, he got a stipend to go to the Salpêtrière in France and spend a year working in Charcot's clinic. And while Freud was there, he examined many of these patients, and he learned to do hypnosis. And when he first opened his practice in Vienna, he was using hypnosis as well as other neurological treatments of the time, such as passing electric current through people to try and change or mitigate these symptoms that people were having. Now, looking back, a lot of people think that all of this was basically created in the patient's minds, that the symptoms were psychological disorders, and the term hysteria isn't even used anymore in psychology. And if you think about it, it's a very sexist term. It infers a weakness and a specificity that only women can have these type of problems. And that's absolutely not true. So you can think about what was going on as, I guess, the prevailing thought of the time. And science was not nearly as rigorous as it is now. Now, clinical hypnosis does in fact work, and suggestion does in fact work. So it's quite possible that some of the patients in Charcot's clinic were hypnotized and suggested into having their symptoms. And in some cases, they could have blatantly been acting or faking because they got positive reinforcement for being dramatic from the patients. In other words, they got better food, better accommodations. They got more attention by the great man himself. Now, in Freudian psychology, when Freud was developing his treatment for hysteria, one of the things that he came upon, was this idea of transference and countertransference. And let me cross the trail and we'll get back to that. Hi, so I'm over on the other side of the trail. And let's get back to the idea of transference. So, one of the things that Freud believed happened in an analytic situation, but between an analyst and an analysand, which is what he called patients, was transference. And what that meant was the person being analyzed would develop feelings for the analyst. And if the analyst remained a blank slate, tabula rasa, then the person being analyzed would transfer transfer onto the patient themes and traits that were significant to them. And these themes and traits would generally deal with the significant person in the patient's past. Now, primarily this was a parent. So, for instance, Freud would take on, in the patient's mind, the role of the father, or possibly the mother, but of the significant person who raised and formed the patient. And that in the analytic situation that was created, the patient would act out whatever the major theme or problem of their life was that kept recurring. So, for instance, if you were in a situation as a child where you're constantly trying to please your parent, then you would act that out in the analytic hour. And that through interpreting different things as you went along in the analysis, you could gain insight and change that relationship and thereby resolve whatever the problem was. Now that's how transference in the analytic hour would work. But also, one thing Freud sought to do was to bring the unconscious issues or problems to the consciousness of the person. So he believed that we repress a lot of these things that happen to us early in life, and then they manifest later in life as symptoms. So he treated lots of different people over the years, and he took each of these instances as evidence that his theory was correct. And many of the problems he dealt with his clientele that were, by and large at that time, mostly young women, were sexual in nature. So initially, Freud had a theory that these women were in fact sexually abused as children, which led to a multitude of problems that he was seeing in his clinic, in his office. And he gave some lectures about the seduction theory. And it caused quite a stir in Vienna, because here was a man who was a physician saying that all of these troubled young women in Vienna society and the clientele he was treating were, by and large, the daughters of wealthy and prominent families in the area, had been sexually abused as children, as young women. And you can imagine that that did not go over well. So later, Freud revised his theory, which he did revise things over time. And he revised his theory to say that, well, the abuse didn't always happen. It was just a fantasy within the young women's minds. So Freud now gave an out to the Viennese society, saying that, well, your daughter may be disturbed, and she may think it's because she was sexually abused by her father or a minister or an uncle or a friend of the family, when in fact she may have not been abused, and she fantasized about a relationship, and that this is being remembered as abuse. Not that it's still not the root of the problem. So many times his interpretations would come back to a sexual desire of the person. So for Freud, his theory really did rest on sexuality and on the drives that we have unconsciously that are causing us to do certain things. So, a lot of his followers wholeheartedly believed exactly what he said, that nothing he said could be wrong. But even Freud modified his theories over time, and had he been given more time, he might have modified them even further, which is what the Neo-Freudians did a generation or so after. So it's fascinating to me, and frankly, I think Freud is not given enough credit for coming up with the idea of the unconscious and unconscious motivations and unconscious drives that push us in certain directions. Now, some of his followers believed that unconscious drives were more important than the sexual theory. And they fell away and developed schools of psychology that still adhere to many of the principles of analysis of the talking cure, but did not focus on Freudian interpretations of sexuality. Jung and Adler are two of the first. And then you have other people later on like Karen Horney and Lacanian analysis, Lacan. But again, Freud was the first to even say that through this close relationship and really listening to the patient or client, you could effect a cure, effect a lessening of symptoms. And the reason he gets tagged with pseudoscience is because almost all of his theories are unprovable and untestable. He relied very much on case studies, and case studies can be subjective, and everyone is unique. So he would take these case studies, including studying himself, and he would project onto a general theory from these specific instances. That's what he did. So recently, as in the past day or so, I've looked up some articles about the efficacy or effectiveness of psychoanalysis. And there are several studies out that show that psychoanalysis is effective in treating depression and anxiety disorders and other kind of psychological problems, but not effective in treating schizophrenia or organic disorders that might require some kind of medication. And this is pretty much in alignment with almost all therapies. So, by just saying that psychological problems could be treated, Freud did a service for humanity. And I think people that scoff at psychoanalysis get hung up on the fact that Freud did something that was incredible, that had never been done before. And yes, he may have had some of his beliefs by the client base he was dealing with, by the fact that he was a Jew being oppressed in Vienna. And he was, definitely. He had a struggle. And by the nature of the material that he was dealing with, that his society at the time, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, was just not willing to look at. In fact, some researchers have gone back and tried to look at some of the early cases and determine, well, were these cases fantasies by the young women, or did actual abuse occur? And I believe that what at least one study that I'm familiar with found is that there was a lot more sexual abuse of young women happening in the bourgeois middle class of Vienna at the time than people admitted or were aware of. So it's possible that Freud's initial theory that these women had been sexually abused was correct, and that when he transformed it into a more palatable theory that people could understand and live with, that they were fantasizing, that he actually had just knuckled under to the pressure of the community at the time. But, when you're looking at something that occurred that long ago, it's difficult to get your finger on exactly what happened and the external pressures that he faced in Vienna were there, and they were real, and they were enormous. So Freud, psychology owes him a debt. And perhaps the treatment and theory have moved beyond what he initially came up with and wanted to, instill as almost a religion. But I will say that his ideas were transformative in the modern world. And much like Darwin, who was one of his heroes, his name and his ideas are known all over the world. In some places, psychoanalysis is practiced regularly, or some form of psychodynamic psychotherapy is practiced. The length of time and the intensity to do psychoanalysis is high. So it doesn't make sense that it's used everywhere. And for that reason, there are not a lot of analysts practicing in the world, but they definitely are out there, and they're filling a role and a niche that certain clients need.